Don't you dare ask us to cancel our trip again. We've been planning this cruise for months. My mother's voice exploded through the speaker. Sharp and final, echoing in the sterile walls of my hospital room. I clutched my phone with trembling hands. My body weak from the pain tearing through my abdomen. It was Christmas Eve at Seattle General Hospital. Rain pelted against the windows. The storm outside mirroring the chaos in my heart. I lay in a hospital bed, struggling to breathe through the agony of a ruptured ulcer, while my 4-year-old son, Oliver, sat quietly in the corner, building a tower out of plastic blocks. Nurse Ava adjusted my IV, throwing me a concerned glance as she overheard the conversation. But nothing hurt more than the cold indifference on my mother's face through the video call. Mom, I need emergency surgery. I have no one else to watch Oliver. I pleaded, my voice cracking. Then figure it out. We're retired now, Lauren. We deserve to enjoy our lives without your constant problems. My father added, his tone dripping with annoyance. I swallowed hard. For the past 5 years, I had sent them $2,500 every month to help with their mortgage, covering the bills they claimed they couldn't afford. Even after my husband died in a hit and run, I still supported them, out of love, out of duty. How foolish I had been. A tear slid down my cheek as I realized the brutal truth. The people I had sacrificed so much for wouldn't even give up a vacation to help their only grandchild when I needed them most. Ava gently squeezed my shoulder. I have a friend who's a nanny. She's wonderful with kids. Let me call her for you. I hesitated for only a moment. Then, through the pain and the crushing disappointment, I made my choice. Yes, please call her, I whispered, and with those words, I began cutting the poisonous ties that had bound me for far too long. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the searing pain in my abdomen or the realization that my parents had just abandoned me in my darkest moment. As I lay in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, memories came rushing back like a flood I had spent years trying to hold back. Growing up, I had always been the afterthought. My younger sister, Rachel, was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. She was charismatic, effortlessly charming, and my parents adored her. Meanwhile, I was the responsible one, the quiet achiever, the daughter who never caused trouble. When Rachel got her first car, it was brand new, a graduation gift from our parents. When I graduated with honors, they barely noticed, too busy celebrating Rachel landing a modeling gig for a local boutique. I should have learned then that their love was conditional, but I kept trying. When I married Jake, the man who saw me for who I was, my parents complained about the venue being too far from their house. When Oliver was born, they visited once, stayed for an hour, and left because newborns are too much work. And yet, when they needed help, I was always the first to step up. 5 years ago, when my father decided to take early retirement, he and my mother weren't financially prepared. They had always lived beyond their means, racking up credit card debt on luxury vacations and impulsive purchases. They called me, voices filled with panic, claiming they were on the verge of losing everything. I couldn't bear to see them struggle, so I stepped in. Every month, without fail, I sent them $2,500 to help cover their mortgage and expenses. Even after Jake died in a hit-and-run accident 2 years ago, I still kept those payments going, because I believed that family should stand by each other. How naive I was. Now, here I was, lying in a hospital bed, bleeding internally, and they couldn't even give up a vacation to help me. A deep ache settled in my chest, not just from the physical pain, but from the truth that had been staring me in the face all along. They didn't love me the way I had loved them. A small, tired voice pulled me from my thoughts. Mommy? I turned to see Oliver standing by the bed, clutching his stuffed bear, his big brown eyes full of worry. I forced a smile. I'm okay, sweetheart. The words felt like a lie. Ava, the nurse, was still beside me, a quiet presence of kindness in the midst of my heartbreak. She handed Oliver a juice box before turning back to me. My friend Claire is a nanny, she said gently. She used to work in pediatric trauma care before going private. She's wonderful with kids, and she can be here within the hour. I hesitated. Asking for help had never been easy for me. I had spent my whole life trying to prove I could handle things on my own. But I wasn't alone. I had Oliver. And if I didn't make it through this surgery, what would happen to him? I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded. Please, call her. As Ava stepped out of the room to make the call, I reached for my phone. My hands were still shaking. But I managed to open my banking app. With a few taps, I canceled the automatic transfers to my parents. For the first time in years, I chose myself. And that simple act sparked something inside me. A flicker of self-worth. A quiet defiance against the years of being overlooked. I didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time in a long time, I was ready to find out. Before I share what happened next, the moment that would turn my world upside down, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to fight for something you believed in? If so, hit that like button. And tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments. I'd love to see how far this story reaches. Because trust me, this is only the beginning. Ava returned a few minutes later. Her expression softer now. She's on her way, she said. Claire will be here in 20 minutes. I nodded, pressing my lips together to keep the emotions from spilling over. The pain in my abdomen had become a dull, persistent throb, but it was nothing compared to the quiet devastation in my chest. I had spent years convincing myself that my parents cared, that despite their coldness, despite the way they always put Rachel first, they still saw me as their daughter. But now, stripped of every illusion, I saw the truth. They had left me behind a long time ago. Oliver climbed onto the bed beside me, curling up against my side. His small hands tugged at the hospital blanket. His face pressed into my arm. Are you really sick, Mommy? His voice was barely above a whisper. I swallowed hard and smoothed his messy curls. The doctors are going to help me feel better. Baby, will you be gone for a long time? A lump formed in my throat. No, sweetheart, I whispered. Just a little while. He nodded against me, but I could feel the tension in his tiny body. He was too young to understand what was happening. But he knew enough to be scared. The door swung open, and Ava stepped aside to let a woman inside. She looked to be in her late 30s, with warm brown eyes and a steady presence that immediately put me at ease. Lauren? She asked gently. I managed a nod. I'm Claire, she said, crouching down to Oliver's level. You must be Oliver. Oliver blinked up at her. Uncertain, she smiled and pulled a small stuffed penguin from her bag. This little guy is named Wally, she said, holding it out. He's been looking for a new friend to take care of him. Oliver hesitated, then slowly reached for the toy. He held it close to his chest. Studying her carefully, Claire met my gaze. I know this is sudden, but I want you to know, I've worked with a lot of kids in tough situations. I'm going to make sure Oliver feels safe and loved while you focus on getting better. I promise. Something inside me cracked. For years, I had been carrying everything on my own. I had fought through grief, through exhaustion, through the crushing weight of responsibility. And now, for the first time, someone was stepping in, not because they had to, but because they wanted to help. Thank you, I whispered, my voice breaking. She nodded, as if she understood exactly what this moment meant. Ava checked the clock. Lauren, they're ready for you in pre-op. I turned to Oliver, who clutched Wally the penguin, his big eyes darting between me and Claire. Baby, you're going to stay with Claire while I go with the doctors. Okay? He gripped my sleeve. But what if you don't come back? My heart cracked open. I cupped his small face, brushing my thumb over his cheek. I will always come back for you. Claire knelt beside him. And I'll be right here the whole time. Buddy, we'll read stories, play some games, and when you wake up, your mommy will be here. Oliver hesitated, then slowly nodded. He still looked unsure, but he let Claire take his hand. A nurse arrived with a wheelchair. I let them help me into it, every movement sending fresh waves of pain through me. Wait, I said. Can you hand me my phone? Ava placed it in my hands, and I took a deep breath. My fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before I typed out 2 messages. The first was to my bank. I canceled the automatic transfers to my parents' account. The second was to my parents. I will no longer be providing financial support. My son and I deserve better than being your afterthought. Don't contact me again. My hands were still trembling when I hit send. I exhaled shakily, then handed the phone back to Ava. As the nurse wheeled me toward the operating room, I should have felt afraid. But for the first time in years, I felt something else. Freedom. When I woke up, everything felt heavy, my limbs, my head, even my thoughts. The world around me was still hazy. The beeping of monitors and the sterile scent of antiseptic the only reminders that I had made it through the surgery. A dull ache pulsed in my abdomen, but it wasn't nearly as sharp as the weight settling in my chest. I was alive. I blinked up at the fluorescent ceiling, my mind struggling to piece together reality. Then, the memory of my last conscious moments came rushing back. The phone call, my parents, Oliver, Claire, my decision. I turned my head slowly, my body protesting the movement, and saw Ava sitting beside me. She offered a soft smile, relief evident in her expression. "You're awake," she said. "That's a good sign." My lips were dry, my throat raw, but I forced out the only words that mattered. "Oliver? He's fine," she assured me. "Claire stayed with him all night. He's been asking about you." Some of the tension in my chest eased, but only for a moment. Ava reached for my phone on the bedside table and handed it to me. "You have a lot of messages," she said carefully. Dread settled in my stomach before I even looked. The screen lit up, confirming what I already knew. Dozens of missed calls, unread messages stacking on top of one another. My parents, Rachel, their names glared at me like a warning. At first, my parents' texts were neutral, even confused. They wanted to know why the bank had called about a failed transfer. They asked if I had simply forgotten to send the money, as if it were nothing more than an oversight. Then the tone shifted. The confusion became frustration, then outright anger. My mother accused me of being selfish, reminding me that they had built their entire lifestyle around my financial support. My father followed with disappointment, berating me for turning my back on family. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us?" Finally, the messages turned desperate. The mortgage was overdue. The bills were piling up. If they didn't get the money soon, they might lose the house. My father's last message was almost pitiful. "Just one more transfer, Lauren. We'll figure something out after that." Not once did they ask how my surgery had gone. Not once did they ask if I was okay. If Oliver was okay. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the phone. I should have been surprised. But deep down, I wasn't. This was who they had always been. I had just never been willing to see it before. I scrolled down and found Rachel's messages. Unlike our parents, her words didn't come with demands. Instead, they carried something else, confusion. She said our parents had told her I was exaggerating, that I had some minor procedure and was blowing things out of proportion. She wanted to know the truth. For a moment, I hesitated. Then, without overthinking, I typed out a response. It wasn't minor. I had emergency surgery. They refused to help me with Oliver because they didn't want to cancel their cruise. That's why I cut them off. Her reply came almost instantly. "Oh my God. I had no idea. I would have watched him if I'd known. I'm so sorry." I let the phone drop onto the blanket, closing my eyes. The realization settled over me like a slow, creeping wave. My parents had lied to her, just like they had lied to me for years, twisting reality to fit whatever story suited them best. They had abandoned me without a second thought. Yet now, when their lifestyle was threatened, they suddenly wanted to talk. I exhaled shakily, exhaustion creeping into every part of me. Ava shifted beside me, watching carefully. "You okay?" I let out a slow breath, staring at the ceiling. "I don't know," because for the first time in my life, I truly had no idea what came next. I spent the next few days drifting in and out of sleep, my body too weak to do much else. Recovery was slow, but each moment that passed solidified something deep inside me. I wasn't going back. I wasn't going to be the person who sacrificed herself just to be treated like an afterthought. Claire continued caring for Oliver, and I could tell he was growing attached to her. Every time he visited my hospital room, he came in holding her hand, clutching his new stuffed penguin like a lifeline. Seeing the way she took care of him, the patience in her voice, the warmth in her presence, It made me realize just how much he had been missing. And yet, my parents hadn't stopped. Their texts kept coming, even after I stopped responding. Their calls turned frantic, their messages more demanding, but I didn't need to read them anymore. I already knew their patterns. Confusion, anger, desperation, then, eventually, the final stage, manipulation. What I hadn't expected was how far they would take it. One morning, Ava came into my room looking more hesitant than usual. She hesitated, then held out her phone. "You might want to see this." I frowned. Taking it, the screen was open to a group email, one sent by my father. It had been sent to the entire extended family. My breath caught as I skimmed the words. He painted me as the villain. Told everyone that I had abandoned them in their time of need. That after all the sacrifices they had made for me, I had heartlessly cut them off, leaving them destitute. There were dramatic details about how they were about to lose their home. How they might end up on the streets. How their ungrateful daughter had turned her back on them for no reason at all. It was a masterclass in guilt tripping. But what they hadn't expected, what they had never even considered, was that I wasn't the only one who had grown tired of their games. My cousin Michael was the first to respond. "Didn't you just buy a new car last month? And wasn't Aunt Patricia flashing a brand new diamond bracelet at Thanksgiving?" Then another cousin chimed in. "If Lauren was helping you all this time, why were you still taking vacations? Why didn't you plan for retirement like normal people?" Message after message came in. And with every reply, the carefully constructed story my parents had built around themselves began to crumble. The truth was, they weren't victims. They were just people who had made selfish choices and expected me to pay for them. Rachel called later that evening. "They're losing it," she said. "They've been calling everyone, trying to find someone to take their side. But no one's buying it." I didn't say anything for a long time. Not because I felt bad, but because, for the first time in my life, I didn't. I had been expecting it. The moment they realized their guilt trips wouldn't work, that no one was rushing to save them, I knew they would come. And I was right. It happened late in the afternoon. Just as I was settling back into my apartment, Claire had taken Oliver to the park to give me some time to rest. And for the first time since the surgery, I had a quiet moment to myself. But the peace didn't last long. A sharp knock at the door sent a jolt through my body. I already knew who it was before I even looked. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, then walked to the door. Peering through the peephole, I saw them, my parents. Standing side by side, my mother clutched her designer purse like a shield, while my father stood with his arms crossed, an impatient scowl on his face. I hesitated only for a second before opening the door just enough to face them. "What do you want?" My voice was steady, calmer than I expected. My mother's expression softened instantly. Her tone sugary sweet. "Lauren, darling, we've been so worried. You haven't been answering our calls. We needed to make sure you and Oliver were okay." My father added, though the way his jaw clenched told me that wasn't why they were here. "We're fine," I said flatly. "Now, if that's all." "It's not all," my father interrupted, pushing slightly against the door. "We need to talk about this ridiculous financial situation." Ah, there it was. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "There is no financial situation. I told you, I'm done." My mother's smile faltered. "Sweetheart, you don't mean that. We depend on that money. Your father and I adjusted our entire lifestyle based on your commitment to help us." I stared at her, barely able to believe what I was hearing. "My commitment?" I repeated, my voice sharp. "I've been sending you money out of guilt and obligation while you lived beyond your means. And when I had an emergency, when I was bleeding out in a hospital bed, you chose your cruise over me and your grandson." My father's face darkened. "That's not fair, Lauren. We had plans." I let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, well, so did I. I planned on having parents who actually gave a damn about me." The silence stretched between us. My mother opened her mouth, likely to spin another excuse. But before she could, a small voice came from behind me. "Mommy?" I turned to see Oliver standing in the hallway, rubbing his eyes sleepily. He had woken up from his nap early. My mother's entire demeanor changed in an instant. She crouched down, fake warmth in her voice. There's my precious grandbaby. Grandma brought presents. Oliver hesitated, his little fingers gripping the hem of my shirt. He didn't move toward her. And that told me everything I needed to know. I looked back at them, feeling nothing but clarity. I think you should leave, I said quietly. When I'm ready to talk, if I'm ever ready, I'll reach out. For the first time, my father didn't argue. Maybe he finally understood that I meant it. I shut the door, locking it behind me, and when I turned around, Oliver was still standing there, looking up at me with innocent eyes. I knelt beside him, brushing his curls back. You okay, buddy? He nodded. Then, after a beat, he asked, are they coming back? I exhaled, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Not if I can help it. 3 months passed, and with every day that went by, the weight on my chest grew lighter. My parents, true to form, didn't disappear quietly. They tried every angle, calling relatives, reaching out to Rachel, even sending letters filled with dramatic pleas about how they were on the verge of losing everything. But I had made my decision, and I wasn't going back. Eventually, reality caught up with them. Without my financial support, they were forced to sell the house they had stubbornly clung to. Their extravagant lifestyle crumbled under the weight of their own bad decisions. They downsized to a small apartment, and my father even took a part-time job at a local hardware store, something he had once scoffed at when I suggested he be more responsible with money. Rachel visited them occasionally, but even she admitted they weren't the same. They were bitter, humiliated, and most of all, angry that their plan to guilt trip me had failed. Meanwhile, my life was changing in ways I hadn't expected. Claire became more than just a nanny, she became family. Oliver adored her, and knowing he had someone who genuinely cared for him brought me a peace I hadn't felt in years. I hired her part-time even after my recovery. And for the first time since Jake's death, I didn't feel like I was carrying everything alone. With the financial burden of my parents gone, I was finally able to breathe. I moved to a quieter neighborhood, one with parks and good schools. I started putting money into savings, something I hadn't been able to do in years. My career flourished now that I wasn't constantly stressed about making ends meet for people who never appreciated it. And most importantly, I felt free. Then, 6 months after my surgery, a letter arrived. It was from my mother. I almost threw it away without opening it. But something stopped me. Inside, the words weren't filled with demands or guilt tripping. For the first time, she apologized. She admitted she had resented me, not for what I had done, but for what I represented. Independence, strength, everything she had never allowed herself to be. She didn't ask for money. She didn't even ask for forgiveness. She just asked if, someday, I might consider letting them meet Oliver. I held the letter in my hands for a long time. Maybe, one day, but on my terms. For now, I had a life to live. A better one, and I wasn't looking back. This story isn't just about family betrayal. It's about breaking free from toxic cycles and choosing self-worth over obligation. It's about realizing that love isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when you need them the most. Lauren's journey reminds us that setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's necessary. What do you think? Comment. 2. If you support Lauren's decision. Or, 7. If you think she should have handled things differently. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Your support helps keep these stories coming.